The crossover between westerns and horror is more limited than I'd like it to be, especially in the space of video games. I have covered a cowboy horror game before and, well, this is how that went. And outside of things like Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare, we're really lacking in big names. There's Hard West, kinda. Dead Money, if you want to count that. Dark Watch, if you've played this, and, I don't know, Alone in the Dark 3? That's really all that comes to mind, and that's a shame, because the Wild West was kind of horrific. Enormous empty stretches of land, wanton crime and violence, countless flavors of superstition, natural peril, and romanticized colonization. All frightening things that are just waiting for somebody to come along and capitalize. There are of course some cool games that get close to this kind of vibe. Dusk and Blood aren't far off from being horror, or at least horror-adjacent westerns, but they don't quite commit to it as much as I'd like. But you know what does? Blood West, a game which follows the strong tradition of being a western and containing the word blood, dead, or west in the title. Nothing's quite hit the grand slam yet, but some have come close. And Blood West is exactly what I've been looking for. A spooky cowboy game that'll have you both rootin' tootin' and hollerin'. The two basic emotions of mankind. Now, one thing that you really have to be careful about when making anything based on the Wild West is how you treat the topic of Native American people and culture. I won't pretend that I'm an expert on it, I'm not, but I have seen enough absolute horse shit made up about skinwalkers and wendigos to recognize some red flags pretty quickly. So when the game opened up on a fairly on-the-nose monologue with generic pop culture understanding of native spirituality, I was a little worried. But they also make it pretty immediately clear that the Native Americans were kinda just chillin', and that all of the issues were caused by colonizers. That was pretty comforting considering how many things just kind of brush over the fact that there was quite a lot of genocide and displacement and land ravaging that happened on top of the funny cowmen and their twirling guns. The story of greedy bastards come in and ruin everything, supernatural forces fight back is pretty standard for horror, so I have very few questions, and that's exactly what's going on here. Demons, ghouls, ghosts, and bastards now run amok, and we take the role of a slightly less villainous demon, ghoul, ghost bastard to try and set things straight. And when I got into the game, I was pretty immediately surprised by what I heard. I recognized two very big voice actors that kind of jump-scared me. Gianni Matrigrano and Stephen Russell. Yeah, Gabriel talks to you via totems, and you, the player, are goddamn Garrett, Corvo, Nick Valentine, Clavicus Vile, Barbus. Yeah, this game's voice cast is an indie game Twitter fanfiction come to life, and I'm frankly all for it. And once we've been given a little bit of lore about what's going on, and what we need to do in the game, we get introduced to stealth mechanics. And whenever I'm provided with the concept of optional stealth in any game I consider covering on this channel, a creeping question starts worming its way into my mind. It's a question that there is no correct answer to. It's a question that, no matter what I say, will be incorrect to somebody. It's a question that most people won't even worry about. But as somebody who talks about video games on the internet, it's one that haunts me. Is this game an immersive sim? Now, if you don't know what an immersive sim is, I wish I lived in your world. It's a simpler and kinder world. Not because immersive sims are bad. Several of my favorite games of all time are immersive sims, allegedly. And it's not that the genre itself frightens me. It's the definition of it, because it's forbidden knowledge. Ask a horror fan how to roughly define horror games. Well, they'll say, it's a game that's scary. Ask a shooter fan how to roughly define shooters. Well, they'll say, it's a game where you shoot. Ask an RPG fan how to roughly define RPGs. Well, they'll say, it's a game where you play as a character that levels up and makes choices and shit. Now, ask an immersive sim fan how to roughly define immersive sims. I dare you. From the depths of a shadowy corridor you didn't know existed will emanate a rattled cacophony of tortured voices that sounds something like this. Emergent gameplay. Player agency.
Simulated systems.
Living world.
Entropy itself. Before one of the many voices decides it disagrees with one of the others, and then they proceed to eat each other in a way that would make a Ouroboros blush. I guarantee people will have huge issues with what I just said, but I also guarantee they'll go to the comments with a 3 to 5 line description of the genre that requires a bachelor's degree in philosophy and some kind of twisted Rosetta Stone to decrypt. I vaguely know what an immersive sim is, and the way I define it would make immersive sim fans foam at the mouth. All I have to ask myself is this kind of like Deus Ex or Prey? If it is, it's probably an immersive sim. but not always. Some games fit some descriptions while being banished to the lowly realm of standard RPG by others, leaving them in a peculiar quantum state of infinite Twitter discourse. So, is Blood West an immersive sim? Some questions are best left unanswered. But what I can tell you is that the variety of player builds and problem solving you can achieve is very impressive. You can be stealthy if you like, and the game supports that with a very strange but fun stealth system that is much more about stacking modifiers and using certain tools and enemy mechanics than your traditional hide in the shadows type stealth. The enemies aren't the brightest, but if you get caught, you get fucked almost immediately. That reminds me, I'm still working on a Fear and Hunger video. Alternatively, you can go nuts with guns, bows, or melee weapons too, and kind of turn it into a full-blown action game. It's kind of like Deus Ex, in that sense. And you're dropped into 3 pretty big Wild West environments which you can explore however you please. You've got your dusty, mine-ravaged desert, weird culty hillbilly swamp, and a forsaken pioneer town nestled away in the mountains. Your items conform to the usual for this kind of game. Big primary weapon, little secondary weapon, trinkets that give you bonuses, consumable items, and rocks! I like the rocks, they're good. Watch me torment this sinner with them. And the trinkets especially play a pretty big role in how your build works. For example, I tried to stack as many stealth bonuses as I could, so I could effectively sneak under enemies' noses and annihilate them with critical hits. But you can also make it so you regen health quickly, gain tons of extra stamina for sprinting and slashing, gain bonus money and so on. And there are skill points as well, but honestly, most of them give you very minor bonuses to stuff compared to what the trinkets and weapons can do. I don't know, I thought they were a little underpowered, but you're definitely going to need to use any edge you can get as the game progresses, because good lord is the combat fucking brutal if you're not specced into it. Even if you are, I imagine some of the enemies will still annihilate you within seconds. And just like Lunacid, which I covered last time, there are different damage types which affect different enemies in different ways. If you're using guns, you can change ammo types. If you're using stealth, you can just kind of ignore it and sneak by. And if you're using melee, you can go fuck yourself, which is a little disappointing. John Hammer is displeased. There are melee weapons that do damage to spirit/ghost enemies, but not many. I'd love to see melee get a little bit more love, but the guns and other ranged weapons are pretty great as is. But let's say, hypothetically, you don't have the right equipment for combat and you get killed by a creature. Oh dear, what are you going to do? Lotus save? Nah. Just get back up, idiot. Every time you die, you resurrect at a bed or totem. It's like a Dark Souls bonfire, but if it hissed at you in Gianni Matragrano's voice. And much like in Dark Souls, every time you die in Blood West, you get a debuff applied to you, much like you would lose humanity, health, or something similar in the Souls games. Hey, immersive sim fans. Learn a lesson from Souls-like fans. That's how you define a genre. Is it like Dark Souls? Hell yeah, brother. That's a Souls-like. The debuffs you get from death range from inconvenient to brutal, and they stack up to 3 times with increasing effects. You can have multiple different kinds of debuff at once as well, which is really not very nice. You can clear them off by doing tasks for Gianni or by drinking the liquid, and it's a pretty good idea to do that as quickly as possible because, as I said, this is not always the easiest game. When you die or rest, some, but not all of the enemies you killed will respawn, so you're pretty much always playing catch-up if you let these debuffs stack. And speaking of the enemies, the variety is pretty great. A lot of them are kind of biblically flavored, representing some kind of sin that corrupted them into an ironic or otherwise cruel version of themselves, like the stick-thin gold miners, the self-obsessed prodigal daughters with irremovable masks, and of course, the one staple of all horror that goes anywhere near indigenous beliefs, the Wendigo. Admittedly, the Wendigo here kind of works. I've made a whole video talking about different depictions of Wendigos and why most of them don't, although this one is alright. It gets a little too animal-y for my tastes, but otherwise it's accurately depicted as a fucked up gluttony beast. It's especially accurate that it shoots flying, homing ghost skulls out of its chest mouth. I'm pretty sure I've read that a few times in proper papers. It still hurts my soul to know that Fallout 76's Wendigo is still one of the best in all of gaming. And on the topic of Blood West's Wendigo, it serves as a really fun example of how the enemies change from area to area. In the desert area, it's a standard Wendigo, big guy, it'll eat ya. In the swamp, it's a much bigger guy with branches and leaves sticking out of him with some weird poison abilities. And then in the mountains, they're replaced by the much smaller guys called the Broken Scream, which is an incredible name by the way, and they're physically weaker but can turn invisible, which scared the shit out of me the first time the game told me I was being pursued by nothing. and then nothing came along and revealed itself to have teeth and such. Most of the game's other enemies have similar changes in between each area too. My personal favourite is the change from the gold miner fella, who turns into a horrible pustule man that spurts hell bats from their neck when they're killed. They're also completely blind, so you can sneak up behind them and just kinda chill. There are also friendly characters and, well, you may notice something about them. In classic Western fashion, all of the men are horrible, greasy weirdos, and the women aren't. But most of the NPCs fall into one of three categories: nice, mean, and generally unpleasant to look at. You know, there are some enemies in this game I don't really want to show because they might trigger YouTube's, like, nudity freakout button, but I think this one is okay. I think if you become, like, ultra naked, YouTube doesn't mind. But anyway, back to NPCs. My favorite is this doctor that keeps asking me very politely if I'll consider donating my body to science while I'm still alive. He takes the rejection well enough. And our own character is an interesting one. You only hear him when you do one of three things as far as I know: pick up an item, kill an enemy, or get hurt. And that's a shame because I would have loved to hear more of Stephen Russell, but then again, hearing him scream at dead enemies at the end of every combat encounter is very good. Talking about combat encounters, there are boss fights in the game, and they do make stealth builds a little tricky. That's why I suggest you couple your stealth build with a deeply troubling neurotic tendency to stockpile all consumables and weapons and never use them. Then the boss fights go quite smoothly when you realize you have no other choice. This particular fight reminds me of the giant Lovecraftian baby god that you fight at the end of Half-Life, and now that's gonna be on my mind for the next few months. Why is he like that? Hey, do you want to see my favorite part of the game though? I found a cat. Twice. Hell yeah, brother, you're mad chillin'. Right, so, a couple of big questions come to mind about Blood West. Firstly, how does it perform as a Western? Well, in my mind, it performs very well. The first two chapters especially have a real twisted Wild West feel to them that is married really nicely to the more horror-adjacent elements. The gunslinger versus hellspawn concept is one that, for whatever reason, just works. The music and level design help too, especially when you're in or around fallen settlements. The third chapter of the game deviates from this slightly as it's much more forward with its demonic and horror elements, but it still has a bit of that Western twang to it. The aesthetics overall are great, even if I'm not a huge fan of needlessly but intentionally pixelated textures. Especially when the game's cinematics are made in an entirely different art style, the pixelation comes across quite jarringly. But after a while I stopped noticing it, and decided not to moan about it for too long. The game's atmosphere is also wonderful. It's quite oppressive, helped by this thick layer of fog and darkness that seems to cover almost everything. And given that you never really receive a light source, you're drowning in that dark the whole time. I seem to remember a few areas that had quite ominous echoes while I explored them. My main memory of that was in the desert's fort area, but that may have just been me hearing enemies going about their business, but regardless, the audio design does make you question things like that while bringing more attention to the environmental storytelling around you. Yeah, you heard that right. I just said environmental storytelling. I'm a professional game analyzer. I'm preparing to fill that MatPat void. The music also adds to the spooky Western atmosphere too, even if it is very low-key most of the time. Westerns need to have good soundtracks, if only because the standard is so high, and Blood West does just fine. Though the best Western soundtrack in all video games still goes to TimeSplitters 2. Good god, its Wild West theme is fucking spectacular. Now that's more or less everything I wanted to talk about. Honestly, if you like Westerns and immersive sims, I'd give this game a try, especially if you're looking for something that's spooky but not necessarily scary. Do note that if you're going into this as somebody that loves stealth games, the stealth system is quite different to most others, as I stated earlier, but I still had a blast with it. Now, one thing to note is that the game is sometimes spoken about in the same breath as another similarly stylized game that was in, and still is in, early access at the same time as Blood West was: Gloomwood. Now, I've played both of these in the states they are currently in, and they do have a lot of similarities, like Gianni Matrograno. And I know loads of people are excited for Gloomwood to come out fully because right now it is quite a terse experience, especially for an immersive sim. So if Gloomwood is keeping you in suspense, check out Blood West for the time being. It's excellent. And that's about it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon. If you'd like to see more from me, I stream 3 times a week on twitch.tv/Painticus, where we're currently going through a few of the Souls games with randomizer mods on, and it's excellent. It brings out the absolute worst in my chat, and I'm all for it. Otherwise, you can support the channel on Patreon, like these fine people have. Special thanks to those at the $10 tier, Ernst the Ace, Untrusted Life, and the original Tex-Mex. But for now, that's a goodbye from me. I'm trying to think of a good way to say goodbye in like an Old West kind of way, but I can't really think of one. So I'll just let the TimeSplitters 2 Wild West theme play me out. Okay, bye.